Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us here at the Korea Society. I'm Tom Byrne, president of the Society, and we are all very pleased to welcome you to this program titled Covering North Korea. North Korea's closed economy and its opacity presents significant obstacles to anyone trying to work in this country. We are fortunate today to be joined by three journalists who are not deterred by that and who share a passion for Korean Peninsula-related news and who bring different skills and perspectives to the table. Chad O'Carroll, to my left, immediate left here, is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Korea Risk Group, which operates NK News and NK Pro. Jacco Zwetsloot, sitting by Jonathan over there, is the host of NK News podcast, which features interviews with experts and journalists about North Korea. Hannah Bae is a freelance journalist and the outgoing Asia American Journalists Association New York president. She was also recently a Kim Koo Fellow here at the Korea Society. Moderating the event this afternoon will be our own Jonathan Corrado, who is the Korea Society's policy director. He also does some writing on North Korea and was formerly a translator for the news site Daily NK. At 1 p.m. today, after this session, we'd like to invite those who have the time and interest to another discussion on the North Korean economy, where we'll be contrasting North Korea with Cuba with a former colleague of mine, Jaime Rouche from Moody's, and also we'll be joined by Peter Ward, who's become probably one of the most experts anywhere on North Korea's regulatory and legal reforms. Next Friday, on February 7th, the University of Connecticut history professor Alexis Dudden will discuss Korea-Japan relations with senior director Stephen Norper. To sign up for that, please visit koreasociety.org. Before I turn to Jonathan, I'd like to invite you all to please help us in welcoming the panelists with a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Tom. Hi, I'm Jonathan Corrado. I'm the policy director here at the Society, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We're lucky to be joined today not only by notable journalists in our stage, but also here in our audience. We also have a visiting class from St. Anne's High School. Thank you very much for coming in. We'd love to incorporate student groups to all of our programming, so thank you for joining us. The format of today's discussion is we'll have a conversation here on stage, and then we'll turn to you for the audience Q&A. So I invite you to start gestating now what kinds of questions you'll have for the panelists when we're ready for that. As we all know, North Korea news tends to move really fast, but it's also steeped in history, and it's prone to cycles. Lack of access is a perennial problem. If the crucial ingredient of a compelling news story is a strong and reliable network of sources, then it is easy to see how reporting on North Korea, with its impenetrable borders and digital firewall, is a frustrating enterprise for even the most determined journalist. On our stage today are three journalists who are so determined to overcome those types of barriers. For the past few years, the Korea Society has tried to help with capacity building and programming. We've hosted 2 rounds of visiting global journalists, sponsored by the US State Department and the Foreign Press Center, helping to train them on Peninsula issues. Our Kim Koo Professional Series trains media professionals along with corporate and United Nations officials to sit down with thought leaders on Korea and Northeast Asia. Hannah is one such fellow. Last year, we had Wong Mei-yi, an amazing photographer from Pyongyang Bureau of AP News. And we also had Jean Lee, a journalist who was instrumental in setting up that bureau in Pyongyang, North Korea. We are all familiar with the parable of the blind men who encounter an elephant for the first time. One touches the elephant's leg and he says, "It's a tree trunk." Another touches the elephant's side and says, "It's a wall." A last touches the tusk and determines, well, this is a spear. They are all right, and yet they are all wrong. Only by critically analyzing the sum of these findings is it possible to see the truth. For all of us in this room who try to understand the realities of North Korea, this will no doubt sound familiar. So I wanted to start by asking you all, what are some of the common obstacles to collecting and analyzing news in North Korea, and what are some of the tricks that you've developed over the course of your career to try to get around those? Chad, I wonder if you could start us off.
One of the things that we do when we get leads information is try and validate, verify it through as many different means as possible, especially if we can get primary source stuff. And believe it or not, there is quite a lot of information out there. North Korean state TV, it's like a blue ocean of primary source material. And oftentimes in the background of North Korean TV, you can see things, cars, for example, luxury Maybach, Mercedes that shouldn't be there. And that can give you a nice lead. But we can also then pair that with things like satellite imagery analysis, talking to sources who are regularly going to North Korea or who live there for professional reasons, checking websites like Flickr. There's a lot of North Korea photos get uploaded there. So there's just like a very wide range of source material out there if you know where to look for. And we just try and collect all of that and synthesize it as accurately as possible. Sometimes we make mistakes. It's not, it's quite an error-prone process, but I'm proud to say that, we haven't made any big mistakes. And yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Hannah, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the field of scholarship around North Korea has grown so much since I first moved to Korea in 2007. I lived there from 2007 to 2013. And at the time, I feel like there were, a couple big names among experts that news outlets would return to again and again. But now the field is diversifying so much more. I'm particularly excited to see more of an investment in bringing in Korean voices as well as the voices of women. There is this amazing Google spreadsheet that's online of women experts on Korea and Japan that I believe was started by Kim Gamel from the Stars and Stripes. And I feel like by looking outside of the usual suspects in terms of who you can interview, we're getting so much richer stories now.
Yeah, and I think that it makes particular sense because some of the most exciting developments in North Korea right now have to do with gender roles. The women are the engines of the marketplaces. The men are off in their factory jobs, and the women, if you watch videos that are smuggled out of these North Korean markets, the people working these stalls, they're all women. So they are the breadwinners for a lot of North Korean families. So it makes sense to also have journalists that understand that perspective as well.
Definitely. I feel just from my own personal networking, meeting Lee Hyunso Lee. She's a defector who has spoken very widely, especially in a famous TED Talk about her own experience of leaving North Korea and finding her way to South Korea. And I feel like by bringing in these different perspectives, it's so important to get a humanizing look at what's actually happening in North Korea. What has bothered me in terms of my own study of journalism around North Korea is when North Korea is used as a punchline or when sensationalist, unconfirmed stories are put out there. And I think that, NK News's dedication to verification, to bringing in voices like the Ask a North Korean series, I feel like that really is bringing in a more truthful side of coverage around North Korea.
Thanks. Jacco, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's not just difficult to get sources and voices out of North Korea. It's also on the podcast, from my experience, it's difficult to get people from the American and South Korean government sides too, right? So we put out a podcast every Tuesday in which I interview somebody with an area of expertise or experience or knowledge about North Korea. And I have to say that most of my requests are either ghosted or are rejected. So, for example, I've on the way to the United States for this particular trip, I sent in requests to Stephen Biegun, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton. I think he's a bit busy this week, but I did want to get him on the show. to talk about his observations and experiences in the Trump administration. That can be quite a challenge. Also, I send monthly requests to the South Korean Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa to come on the podcast, and I typically get a copy-pasted answer that she's too busy this week and maybe forever. But we keep plugging away because eventually I do get some minds changed and they do come on. But that is always the big obstacle, is getting someone to come and talk on the record about North Korea.
Thanks. Right. It's very evident that if one were to do an ethnography of North Korea watchers, that it would look like a very unique community. It attracts all different sorts. So I wanted to ask you all about your personal experience. How did you get attracted to this field in the first place, and what excites you about it? We just talked about some of the problems and some of the tough aspects of it, but I want to get to what lured you in first of all, and then what's kept you interested about this beat.
Well, I went to North Korea in 2009 as a tourist, and I found it really fascinating, and it made me go back 2 more times. And I thought, a lot of people knock tourism. They think that it's just a sort of preordained trail that you go on and you just, exposed with propaganda the whole time. But there's a surprising amount you can learn, and you can travel a lot more throughout North Korea than you can on any official delegation for a journalist. Normally, journalists just go to Pyongyang. So tourism was what really drew me in. And I think it also opened my eyes to where you could collect information conceivably from foreigners who are going into North Korea. What excites me, scoops, where if we can get some nice exclusive news, that's always a good feeling. We had a story last week. We found out that the North Korean foreign minister had been sacked and replaced with a gentleman called Ri Son-kwon. And I've just had a baby, and it was 3 a.m. and I couldn't sleep, and some sources were texting me, and I actually wrote the story from bed and pressed publish. And that's quite an exciting feeling, because you don't know if you're 100% right. You've got four sources lined up that say something, and then questions start going through your mind, like, are the sources manipulating me? Is this to embarrass us? But just gambled, and turned out it was right. And so that was definitely an exciting feeling.
For sure. And you kind of glazed over this, but you just had a baby.
Oh, yes.
Congratulations.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
In the time that I was living in South Korea, I feel like so much changed in terms of our access to North Korea and just political events in North Korea. So from 2007 to 2013, of course, we see the collapse of the six-party talks. We see the sinking of the Cheonan, the opening of the AP's news bureau in Pyongyang, the death of Kim Jong-il. And so I felt like it was a very exciting time to be on the ground in South Korea. And now I feel like I am less of a direct participant in the journalism that is produced about North Korea, but still very much a spectator and somebody who follows this field with much interest. I would say that in my experience with the Kim Koo Fellowship, it was such a great opportunity to talk to experts whom I've seen, as words on a page right across the table from me. And I think that, especially coming off a couple of years where there was a lot of optimism about North-South relations, I felt like this real sense of being jaded after seeing so many back and forth forces at play. And so to be able to have these frank discussions with experts like Victor Cha, it was incredible.
Thanks.
I would echo that really excites me. When Chad asked me 2 years ago to start doing a podcast for NK News, I thought, here's my chance to actually meet some of these people who, as you say, were until then either just words on a page or were voices on the Korea Society podcast, which I listen to weekly. So that's what's really fun, is to be able to meet these folks who are either currently serving in some official capacity or have had that experience in the past, and to really get down, in the details, in the weeds, so to speak, with them. But how it all started for me, I first went to South Korea in 1996 with the South Korean government's EPIC program, right, English program in Korea. So I was an EPIC teacher working at a middle school up in Paju, which is the county in Gyeonggi province that borders North Korea. So very close to Munsan, very close to Panmunjom. And I was lucky enough to be able to catch North Korean television on my TV at home, just by accident, because I was living in a kind of a dip, I suppose, where the South Korean military's jamming signal did not effectively jam the North Korean. So you could see the two, you could see the North Korean TV and the South Korean jamming signal test pattern simultaneously on the TV screen. So it wasn't very good for the eyes, but it was fascinating to watch it. And at the same time, I happened to be reading George Orwell's Animal Farm. And I thought, wow, here it is. This is, it's happening right before me. And I would watch these. At that stage, my Korean wasn't very good; I was still learning. And I was watching, Kim Jong Il going out there doing the on the ground inspections or on the spot inspections, and male military choirs singing these songs of praise, and the highly excitable and emotional newscaster doing the news reads. And every day from 5 to 11 it was on, and I'd get bored after a few minutes. So I'd start to skip to other channels, off to AFKN to watch a bit of American TV, and then after a while I go, let's see what the North Koreans are doing. I'd go back again. And that started this lifelong fascination with North Korean propaganda. That at that stage the two Koreas were still very much active in trying to persuade citizens of the other half, we're the better Korea, come on over, come and cross the border. And so the North Koreans would send leaflets, and at certain schools near the DMZ you could hear North Korean music wafting over the rice fields. And so from that moment I knew this is something very interesting, and I was hooked.
Fellow teacher. I was in Gwangju for a year. Yeah.
Also EPIC?
No.
Okay.
Just at a Hagwon. I don't have the prestige of the EPIC program.
It's all a question of luck.
Yeah. I feel like when we're looking at propaganda, it's almost like, if you remember that scene from The Matrix, when they're looking at these streams of digital code going down the screen, and they say, well, yeah, I don't even see the code anymore. I see what it means. And that's how I feel about North Korean propaganda, whether it's press statements, whether it's television. There are certain motifs that come and repeat themselves, and then there's the deeper meaning embedded in those. And it takes a while to be able to sort out the noise from the signal. So I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit. What are some tips? How have you sort of been able to navigate that environment? Because it's a tough one, but it's also a really rich source of material as well.
Yeah, we've built a system on our website called KCNA Watch, which basically is a bunch of scripts which are like automatically going to all of the main North Korean propaganda websites, and then they do what Google actually does and copies it into a database and makes it searchable. So when we have all that stuff coming into our database, we can code systems to allow you to configure alerts, for example, so that you can get an email if certain keywords come up in state media. We're also collecting all the TV, so we record that every day and host it. Though that from a technical perspective helps, but then you also need people to be able to analyze that and make the most of it. And we have a really excellent analyst called Min Young Lee, who just joined us last year, who's has almost 20 years experience analyzing state media from North Korea. And someone like that on the team really helps to understand, because there are a lot of experts, you're right, but there are a lot of experts that are frankly generalists and don't have the understanding to really scrutinize those state media statements. And so having someone with like practical experience, like 20 years as she does, versus a scholar focused on Asia writ large, it's a big difference. And I still see a lot of journalists reaching out to specialists that are not necessarily the best fit for certain stories. Anyway, yeah, that's just a small...
Yeah, and Rachel Min Young Lee is fantastic. I can't tell you how many times over the past year I've thought, here's a story, and I'd pitch it and be like, maybe this is an angle, and she's already written that story. So she's really on top of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see this rise in interest in like the visual propaganda from North Korea, especially from an aesthetic perspective. Like, I was walking down the street in Brooklyn the other day and happened to see a man wearing an Air Koryo shirt, and I was just like, "Where is this from?"
That might
Yes,
be
that's what it
NK News.
turns out.
Yeah.
That's what friends told me.
Visit nkshop.org.
It's closed down now.
Oh, it's closed down. I'm sorry.
But yes, it's been really fascinating to see. And then, you see, for example, in Parasite, the maid character does the impression of a North Korean newscaster. And, if you aren't familiar with these touchstones of North Korean representation, you don't get it,
Right.
But it's really cool to see it kind of getting out there in the culture. I don't personally plan on buying a North Korean propaganda poster. Like, I think when you are traveling in North Korea, you have to be really careful, right? Like, not trying to steal banners, for example. And
breach sanctions.
oh, yes, that too. But yeah, it's great that you have experts who are able to take such a detail-oriented look at the media that's coming out of North Korea.
One interesting thing, though, that's happening is North Korean state TV, which we are watching daily and analyzing. They've started actually. I think they realized that people like us are using it as a sort of lens into some things, because stage managing TV, it's a lot harder than text, right? There's so much going on in the background outside of the cameraman's control, the camerawoman's control. And they've started blurring the background. So they'll be doing an interview and all these signs would be blurred. But the people who are doing the blurring, they don't do it very a good job of it. So sometimes it's blurred, other shots it won't be. Sometimes it's really mundane stuff, like there was something about a tree nursery and they had the stuff on the back blurred. It's very odd. But that, as they get better at that and as it becomes more common, it means that we're going to find less leads from the state TV stuff, which in turn will mean less information getting out. So that's a negative.
I remember seeing just one quick point about Parasite. I wonder how many American audience members recognize that performance as the lady in pink that we see so frequently on what's she on, KCNA?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure that South Korean audiences caught that reference. In terms of
If I can say a quick thing about
yeah,
propaganda.
please.
So I when I went to North Korea on my first trip to Pyongyang in 2010, I went to everyone's taken to the Kim Il-sung Square Foreign Bookshop. It's one of the major stops on the itinerary. And I wanted to get something interesting to read in Korean, but I find that looking at North Korean novels or North Korean books in Korean, it's very hard on the eyes. South Korean texts, there's a lot of spacing between the lines and wide margins, so it's easy to read. But North Koreans, they're conserving paper, margins are small, text is very close together, and the paper is very thin, so you'll see the text from the page behind, and so I don't want that. I want comic books. So I asked the lady at the Kim Il-sung Square bookshop, do you have any comic books that show the true evil nature of the American imperialist bastards? And she loved that. She said, oh yeah, she went to the back and came with these 3 comic books, and that's how my fascination with North Korean comic books began. I thought, oh, they really make these comics that show some of them show clear Japanese influence, and some of them show clear American influence. So I ended up doing a master's thesis about North Korean comics as a propaganda vehicle for giving the youth, the next generation, giving them the worldview of who's good and who's bad in the world.
Right.
And that's a lot of fun, because it's different from the other forms of propaganda that we're used to in either in posters or on TV or in newspapers. It's a bit more. It's designed to also be entertaining as well as conveying a message. So if anyone out there works for a publisher and would like to have some English translations of North Korean comic books, I have a few that are awaiting publication. So.
Good pitch. We'll see if we get any response afterwards. Please send that to me. That sounds really interesting. One metric that I found really helpful is this notion by B.R. Myers about inner track versus outer track propaganda. One really important thing that we need to keep in mind is who's the audience for this. So not all propaganda is created equally, and not all propaganda is created with the purpose of aiming at the outside audience. Some of it isn't intended, most of it is made by the propaganda and agitation department. Some of it aimed specifically at a domestic audience, and that's the stuff that goes into the weekly criticism sessions, etc. And then other content is created with a global audience in mind. So that's one really difficult element that only comes with 20 years of experience, as you noted before, to be able to parse that out.
Absolutely. There's a small book in North Korea published in red with a title, The 10 Principles of Establishing a Monolithic Leadership Ideology. And this is basically the 10 commandments for every North Korean. Every North Korean has it memorized. Every North Korean weighs up their own life to those 10 points in the weekly self-criticism sessions. And when I went there last year, I saw a new edition of this book, 2019. So I said, oh, can I buy this? And I was absolutely told by every bookshop, every guide, this is not available for foreigners. And so it was a clear example of this inner track, which is, it's the most important document for North Korean living, much more important than, say, the Constitution or laws or even the Rodong Sinmun. And yet, they don't show it to us. We don't see any quotes from it. It's not on the posters. You can't buy it in the bookshops. It's only available because some intrepid people have smuggled out copies, and that's why we have the full text of it on the internet.
We got the chance to see Tae Young-ho, the diplomat who was formerly posted in London and escaped with his family. And he said, make sure you monitor these weekly video criticism sessions. He called them Saturday videos because they're naming and shaming particular people for different infractions. So the video that he showed us was people wearing Western-style clothes with English lettering on them. And they would say, here's this person, their name is this, they're from this region, and this is how old they are. But by watching that, you see they're shifting priorities. What's important to them in terms of cracking down or backing off? Because that's a very gray area. So watching these things on a regular basis helps us to know where are the priorities at any given moment.
Yeah, Jonathan, I thought it was really interesting to see on NK News the piece that you wrote about how technology is changing North Koreans' access to media too. I wondered if you could tell us a little more about your piece.
Well, geez, I'm blushing now. Yeah, so this is really interesting. So there's been this tug of war almost between the government and the population for access because, of course, North Koreans are hungry for outside content, mostly for entertainment. So when Seoul National University does this annual poll of defectors and asks, what's the content that you most like to see? Well, what would your guess be? Maybe you'd guess they're interested in news about North Korea, maybe about the outside world. They're most interested in news about South Korea. They're secondly most interested in entertainment about South Korea. But these priorities don't match the availability. The thing that they're most likely to view is Chinese content, and that's a question of availability, right? But new technologies have, on the one hand, an SD card is much easier to hide than a DVD player. And
can be removed from the computer, even if the state security people turn off the electricity to the whole apartment building. Whereas back in the 1980s, if you had a VHS that you're watching, they turn off the electricity, you can't get that thing out fast enough before there's someone at your door to inspect your VHS player.
Right. So now with things like they're using network signal finders to be able to, German produced, to be able to locate people using radio, using cell phones near the border because they're using the Chinese networks to make international calls. So they shut down the North Korean network. So therefore, anyone still using a cell phone after they shut down the North Korean network is using the Chinese network. And they use these radio signal finders to go and track them down.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about stories because that's what journalists are principally, right? They're storytellers. So I wanted to ask you, what stories over the past year have been most enduring for you and why? And what do these personal stories coming from North Korea tell us about changes in North Korean society at large?
The story I found most interesting was, which some of you may be familiar with. We got a tip in September last year that the North Koreans were building a hotel for Donald Trump in Pyongyang. And we should look out for this because it's a sign that Trump may be coming to Pyongyang. It sounded far-fetched, but I started asking people in Pyongyang, like, have you seen construction? And we started getting information about new security processes that the North Koreans were installing. So, for example, we heard that they were putting window bars up on people's apartments to stop them looking outside the windows. And we also heard that photos were banned from the top of the Juche Tower. We heard that helicopter flights over Pyongyang were suspended for tourists. All of these things basically adding up to show that there's a real sort of paranoia that's grown in North Korea in the last year. In fact, since the Hanoi summit. And these window bars, when you see photos of them, I was able to get some from both outside and inside. They're made of concrete. They're like large concrete slats that would cover these windows and make your room very dark, feel like a prison. And they all face a certain direction. It seems to be to prevent people from either using acoustic laser sounding listening devices, or potentially using weapons to target areas of the Korean Workers' Party headquarters. And for me, it was just so incredible because some of the apartments in Pyongyang that have been given to elites, for example, Changchun Street, which was built 100-year anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth, to be gifted one of those and then have the State Security Bureau install these window slats, it's going to make the house value go down. And it potentially can also foster some, anger and frustration from residents whose apartments are now being turned into prison cells, effectively. So it was quite mind-blowing that happened.
So a lead that brought you down a totally unexpected direction,
Yeah,
but was
it
very
did.
fruitful.
And just the other thing I wanted to mention is because of the growth of sanctions in the last, especially 2-3 years. I'm not very comfortable about this, but we often find ourselves writing stories about very, very granular sanctions breaches. I investigated one last year about Singaporean soft drinks that were going to North Korea, and they breached very harsh Singaporean trade ban, and they contain metal, which is on a list of commodities that North Korea shouldn't be able to import. And I thought, it made me feel uncomfortable writing it because I'm thinking that the people that consume these drinks are just common North Korean people. And is it really that bad? But sanctions are at a point now where I think we're going to see more of this. If North Korea starts doing ICBMs and nuclear tests again, we're going to see even more granular sanctions being implemented. And that's going to mean a lot more kind of silly stories that clearly won't help facilitate denuclearization, but we actually have strong demand from government readers for those kinds of stories.
Yeah, I think that, since 2010 or so, there's been this kind of cumulative effect of more stories coming out of North Korea. Like the first book that really blew my mind in terms of a storytelling perspective about North Korea was Barbara Demick's Nothing to Envy.
Sure.
And then last year we had Anna Fifield's new book come out, and she has produced excellent journalism from Northeast Asia for such a long time now. And then we have Victoria Kim for the LA Times. I think she just published a piece today about North Koreans in South Korea who are teaching cooking classes and, being able to convey aspects of their culture through the food that they cook and sharing aspects of life, more of a dependency on tofu, for example, as a protein. So it's really exciting to see. And, even from a fictional perspective, Chris Lee wrote her fantastic novel, How I Became a North Korean, in 2016. So we see a lot coming out from, both from the fictional and the non-fictional perspectives, which I think has started to really flesh out kind of what North Koreans are like and what are their motivations,
Right.
and what implications does that have for their politics.
And getting to directly, I mean, through fiction, but also through food, getting to experience what life is like for them is a very rich kind of experience. I remember trying North Korean sundae. I really love blood sausage. Sundae is like my favorite Korean food. And North Korea's variety is especially delicious. You'll find some Pyongyang naengmyeon on the wall over there as part of Gangik Chun's artistic gallery exhibition about unification. So a really strong symbol there.
Yeah. I think Michelle Yehi Lee at the Washington Post wrote a nice personal piece about the significance of Pyongyang Naengmyeon in her own family after seeing the, I think, 2016 Inter-Korean Summit. So I think bringing in these personal perspectives is also really great. And I had a friend who grew up in the border areas, who's a journalist, who talked about as a child finding these propaganda leaflets and how if you turned them into the local police station, she would get like erasers and pencils and things. And I can't wait for more of these kinds of stories to come out to show like the detailed nuances of life on both sides of the border.
Yeah, and in doing the podcast, because I have such a diversity of people who I interview. Some of them are analysts and some are government people, but some of my favorite podcasts have been talking to people who have had a direct narrative to share. For example, one of the early ones I did was with former Australian diplomat Adrian Buzo, talking about his experience of opening up the very, very short-lived Australian embassy in Pyongyang back in the 1970s, and then having just 24 hours to leave Pyongyang when the North Koreans announced, "We don't need your embassy anymore." That was a great story. Or Monique Macias, the daughter of the former president of Equatorial Guinea, who wrote a book in Korean, I'm Monique from Pyongyang, about her experience growing up from the ages of 9 to 16 in Pyongyang under the direct care of Kim Il-sung and her life after, including the 3 years she spent living here in New York. Now, talking to her, and actually we were only able to do a short interview with her because she's hoping to get that book published in English at the end of this year, and she's waiting for that to come out before doing a larger talk. So we actually talked about my interview with her was focused on the 1989 World Festival of Youth and Students, which those who have listened to the podcast will know has been a particular fixation of mine. Last summer we did a mini-series just getting people who had been there to come and tell us their stories about that. And then most recently, of course, on the day before Christmas, we released a 3-part special episode based on 2 days that I spent with a young American gentleman who went to North Korea. The first time he went the right way, and the second and third times it all went very straight. It's an incredible story. On the third time to North Korea, he deliberately put himself in a situation in which he had to be arrested.
Whoa.
Has anyone heard that? It's an astounding story. Now, when Chad and I, first of all, he contacted Chad and they had a 3-hour phone conversation together. And then Chad said, "Jacco, I think this is something we should do a podcast." And so, first of all, we had to do some verification process, like we do with all news stories, to see, do any of the details match up with things that other people can say are correct? And when we did find enough points to convince us that, yes, there's meat to this story, the story has legs, then we were able to go ahead and do it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have published it. And there have been a couple of episodes where, one memorable one where I interviewed somebody who talked about how he believed he was detained in Pyongyang by a state security agency. And then I talked to some other people and they couldn't verify that. And in fact, in some cases, directly contradicted the story. And we had to just can that story. We couldn't release it. But yeah, storytelling, I mean, that is really what separates humans from animals, is that we tell narratives, we tell stories about things that are not here. And that's something that we find, entertaining and interesting. It's why Netflix exists.
Well, thank you all for doing your bit in bringing those stories out under these incredibly difficult circumstances. Well, a couple housekeeping items before we transition. Please join us again next Friday. We're going to do Korea-Japan relations. If you would like to join us for the next session at 1 p.m. right over there, starts in just a couple minutes. We're going to be talking about changes in the North Korean economy. Our president, Tom Byrne, is going to sit down with Jaime Royce of Moody's Investor Services and Peter Ward of NK Pro. So if you're interested in the economy and some of the seismic social changes happening these days with a critical comparison to Cuba, it's going to be a fascinating discussion. Please join us in the boardroom. Our students are soon going to be lectured here briefly by our arts and culture director, Jay. Jay's in the back there. Hi, Jay. So you guys can stay put. She'll give you a brief talk about Gangik Chun and then take you back to the gallery. We ask that you please be a little quiet because we're going to be doing our conversation in that boardroom.
And everyone, please check out the NK News podcast. I have to plug my own product.
Of course.
Do please check it out.
Please help me to thank our panelists and thank you for coming today.
Thank you.